Thank you very much for this initiative. I really appreciate that we're coming together for African ornithology. It's a very good thing that we're doing. As Eli has said, I'm at the Nairobi Museum, and for the last couple of years, I've been interested in energy and birds. So there's this relationship that birds have with the power lines, and I thought that I could bring it to the fore. Some of you might be already working in these areas and know things that happen between birds and power lines, and some of you may not. So I thought that I would try to make an introductory presentation to the rest of us who haven't, and those ones who have, please bear with me. But I'll just go through some of the conflicts that we are already having with between power lines and birds. And at the end, I'll give a little bit of a few things that we are trying to do here in Kenya, because it turns out that it is kind of like a novel problem that the ornithologists or biologists at large have not paid attention to. So if you look at this photograph, you see a gray kestrel, and it's on top of power line pole. And it looks relaxed because it's on its perching, hunting perch, and part of its body, the tail, is touching an energized contactor, and the feet are on this metal bit that is grounded on the pole. So from the outside, if you look at this, you see that the bird is relaxed, it's okay, and there's no problem. It's just resting. However, this bird, as you see, its life is hanging on a feather, because if you look at this, the tip of the tail is touching this energized conductor, and the feet are on this grounded part of the pole. The only reason why this bird is alive is because feathers are bad conductors of electricity. If they were wet, then it would be electrocuted. Now, if this bird was perching on these conductors, like somewhere here, with both feet, as bee-eaters, swallows, and other many birds do, then it will not be at risk, because there will be no electric potential or difference in electrical charge between the 2 feet, and it will be safe. So for that reason, you find out that there are even valid questions people ask is like, why are birds not electrocuted by electrical power lines? And the valid answer that biologists give is that they perch on power lines with the same electrical potential. Yes, that's true, but it's also true that most birds get electrocuted and die from these power lines. So that's what we're going to talk about. So there are 3 reasons why power lines are lethal to birds. First one is that they electrocute them. And as we've seen in the previous slide, is that this happens when the bird perching or nesting on a power line completes the circuit by touching 2 live wires, or touching a live conductor and earth or the grounded part of the power line. Sometimes big birds, eagles, vultures, nest on power lines, and because the air around these energized conductors somehow becomes ionized, streaming, for instance, like when they pooping, or the material that they use to make their nest can also produce an arc, electrical arc, and that can electrocute the birds. So the other source of mortality is by collision, when birds fly into these conductors and they are either killed from impact or from hitting the ground. Sometimes they sustain injuries that are life-threatening, or they may not be in a position to fly because their wings are broken and they're eaten by other predators. So the third way that power lines impact birds is through displacement, and that is when the power companies clear wayleaf for birds. For installing these power lines, they affect some of the pasturing birds that live in these areas. So the standard wayleaf for, say, a high transmission power line in Kenya would be about 30 meters, so 15 meters on both sides. You can imagine that if it's like 10 kilometers through a forest reserve, that's a huge destruction of habitat for some of these birds. So next slide, please. Yeah, so for collision, it's usually a problem for birds that cannot change course in flight easily. For instance, flamingos, pelicans, storks, bustards, cranes, and vultures. They're not as agile as falcons. So because when they're using, for instance, a cushion of air, soaring through a cushion of air, and there's a power line ahead, they may not be in a position to change their course quickly. So they end up colliding with these conductors. And in electrocution, we see this for mostly raptors because they tend to perch on these towers and poles, searching for prey, and they end up getting electrocuted by them. Sometimes because they are completing the circuit or because they're nesting on them, and an arcing from any of those energized conductors electrocute them. Next. Some of the case studies that we have, I just picked these ones from Africa, is that the Ludwig's bustard, a bird that is native to Namibia, Botswana, and western parts of South Africa, was uplisted from least concern to endangered simply because most of the individuals were involved in collision with power lines. So you can see how terrible these effects can be on a given population. And I think this is just the study that was done on that particular bird, but you'd find out that birds more or less with a similar flight behavior size could also be in problems with these power lines in that general region. The African white-backed vulture, at least that's relevant for our region, and the Cape vulture. Studies in South Africa show that power lines have been a factor in the decline of their population within their range. Next. So before we continue, I wish to take you through the power grid, because I think we need to understand how power is transferred from the energy conversion point to us. And maybe by understanding the different parts of the power grid, we may see where most of the problems are and brainstorm on some of the possible changes that can be made so that the whole power grid is safe to birds. So this is a standard power grid that has three important sections. The first one is the energy conversion section in blue, and the second one is the transmission section in green, and the third one is the distribution section in brown. So the distribution section also involves the consumption section. They are light and heavy consumers of electricity, and those ones are also included there. So I'll go in details a bit on these three parts of the power grid, and I hope that it will form the discussion that will come afterwards. Next, please. So let's start with the power plant. And here we can see that, well, they usually call them power generation companies, but they're not generating anything because we cannot create or destroy energy. Basically, what they're doing is that they're converting one form of energy to another one. In this particular case, these are wind turbines that are rotating. The blades are rotating from the motion of air, and that rotary motion is being turned into electrical energy in a generator that sits in the wind turbine generator itself. So it can be anything there. Replace the wind turbines with a hydro dam, and the energy that's coming from falling water rotates some turbine, and then that turbine rotates into a generator, and the kinetic energy from the falling water is turned into electrical energy. So the sources are many, including solar right now that's catching up. So once the energy is generated, then there is the next step of how to push this to the customers. And customers are far away, some of them hundreds of kilometers away. So the engineers are now caught in a dilemma, because actually most of this energy is generated at very low voltage. Now, ideally, if you look at this, it from an electrician or electrical engineer's point of view, then the best thing to do once the energy is generated is to have like a big rod of a good conductor of, say, gold, silver, aluminum, or copper, and with a low resistance, and then push it to the customers at low voltage. So no problem. This can be, the rod can be protected and from elements and birds, and then we have no problem with them. But that's not possible because these superconductors are expensive. So the ones that engineers use, the aluminum and copper, are expensive. So they can only afford thin rods of aluminum or copper. And this thin rod of aluminum or copper can only transport low current because they have high resistance. So the way that the engineers go around this, and I don't think it's like if they have any other option, if you look at the relationship between power, voltage, and current, is that they have to increase the voltage. And by increasing the voltage, they push this voltage through these now thin conductors, and they have to use these big towers to carry this current at high voltage away from the ground. That's how we end up with this overhead high transmission voltage power lines. And of course, now the problems that they have with birds. So next one. Just before you move to the next one, I would like to point out that the high transmission or the overhead power lines in Kenya are almost close to 6,000 kilometers. And to put that into perspective is the distance, more or less the distance between Dakar and New York straight line. Next. Now, here is the problem now, the distribution bit. This is where the big deal is. The transmission, as I said, lines are way high up in the ground. I think I'll talk about it a little bit later. But when it gets to the distribution, because the voltage is now stepped down by these step-down transformers, these cables or conductors or energized conductors are on poles that are not more than 12 meters high. And when it gets even to like close to where we live, these poles have transformers on them, other step down transformers, to further bring down the voltage from 10 kilovolts to 240 volts, because that's what we need. And with that, you can see that the voltage has decreased. The voltage is like a pump, the pump that pushes current through these conductors. So because the pump is now small, it means that the current cannot be pushed long distances. And that is the reason why there are many transformers on poles near where we live. And I can actually challenge you that right now you are not any more than 400 or 500 meters away from one. Now, the distribution lines in Kenya cover close to 44,000 kilometers. And that is the distance between Cairo and Cape Town, 4.5 times. You can now see the matrix that we're talking about. Okay, next. So now I will, because we're going to use some electrical engineers jargon here, I would like to go through the parts of a high voltage transmission lattice tower. And here, as you can see on the left, is a tower that has got about like 50 meters from the ground. And it has got the top bit that, of course, supports the conductors, and the bottom bit. The reason why it's that tall is because these high voltage conductors are not insulated with rubber or plastic, but instead they are insulated, they are air insulated. That's what the term that engineers use, meaning that the conductors are spread apart a fair enough distance between them to a point that they cannot arc each other or short circuit each other. They do the same to raise them as far as they can from the ground so that they produce no arcing in the vegetation that's nearby. And I think that's one of the reasons why the way lift is always cleared for this kind of pylons. So if you look on the right, you will see that we have, of course, a similar lattice tower. And there are some bits that I want to point out. There are those dark bits. Those are insulators. They are between the conductors and, of course, the tower itself. It protects short-circuiting of the tower. And we have that in the middle. We have those thin lines above them, the ones that are above the three conductors, and that's the earth line, or the OPGW, they call it, optical ground wire. Those are the most dangerous ones to birds because they're very thin and flying birds cannot see them. Next, please. There are different types of transmission lattice towers. There is starting all the way from the waist type tower to the most commonly used, the double circuit tower, to guide cross rope suspension towers. You can see that most of them are freestanding, and I think that's good if they don't have stay wires. But I would like to mention, to point out at this point, is that in critical habitats where we think that the birds might collide with this kind of transmission lines, it's recommended that the guide cross rope suspension tower be used. Why? Because it's the one with the least chances of patching areas for the birds. Because the problem is when the birds patch on them and maybe try to nest on them, then we will get all these problems with collision and electrocution. I also wish to point out that from studies that have been done, these high voltage lattice towers are not really terrible in causing death by electrocution, but they're really bad news when it comes to collision because the earthworm is too small and cannot be detected in time by flying flocks of birds. Next, please. Now, this is where most of the electrocution occurs, the distribution lines. And you can see that now the poles have been reduced all the way from 50 meters to barely 15 meters from the ground. And if you look at the distribution pole on the right and look at the configuration, you see that the conductors are only 1.2 meters away from each other, and they are on these upright insulators. Then the crossbar itself is metallic, meaning that if you had a bird like a yellow-billed kite anywhere in the crossbar area, then it can easily bridge this, complete the circuit by touching the two conductors at the same time. And it will, of course, get electrocuted. Now, the pole itself is wooden, which is a good thing because wood is not a good conductor of electricity. But I think in the next slide, I'll be talking about something that is happening, I think, more or less all over Africa. That's really, really crazy, that most governments are now turning to concrete poles instead of wooden poles. And on top of that, they're still using metallic crossbars. Those are actually death traps for most birds. I emphasize, think about it. Like the conductors are only 1.2 meters away from each other. They are on a crossbar that's metallic, a pole that's grounded, and then you have birds like black kites or even the yellow-billed kites with the wingspan also that can go all the way up to 1.5 meters, and they easily can perch on the crossbars. Most of them die. Next. So these are the death traps for birds. The Kenya government decided to switch from the wooden poles to concrete poles. I think maybe one of the reasons was to cut down on maintenance costs. I don't know. But these are bad news. Why? Because concrete itself has got soft rocks in it. And these soft rocks have iron in them, and iron can rust. Also, when manufacturing these concrete poles, they reinforce them with metal rods. Now, if you look at that photograph on the left, what that means is that even though the pole is grounded, if a bird sits on any of those energized conductors and it's wet, then the concrete itself will be another good conductor of electricity, and of course to electrocute the birds. So most birds die from these kind of poles. They are bad news, and what I can say is that we're really, really trying. I think I'll talk about it later, but if there is a way that any one of us can actually champion our governments to return to wooden poles, I think we would have done a good job to reducing a significant number of birds from dying from electrocution, these poles. Next. So how can we make power lines safer for birds? There are many ways. For already existing power lines, we can simply make them visible. So for high transmission lines, we can use bright orange marker balls. I think these are also required by the flight agencies. And this can be done this can be fixed in critical areas so that the migratory flyways or places that have got good traffic of birds, so that the birds moving from one place to the other can easily see that there's an obstruction ahead. There are bird diverters on the right. This can also make the conductors visible from a distance. I want to point out that the only study that I've seen that I've tried to actually put together the efficacy of these diverters and markables is from Spain. And it was not quite definitive if they are effective at all. Next. So the second way that we can make power lines safer for birds is to deter birds from nesting or roosting on the lattice towers or posts. So we can use patch guards. These are basically materials, non-conductor materials that you can put anywhere on the crossbar to deter birds perching on them. On the right, you can also use supplemental patches. And how this works is that you raise a platform above the crossbar and then create another patch on it. And as you can see, the white stock are happily nesting on those. So you can actually end up combining both the two, using the patch guards and supplemental patches to separate or increase the distance between the birds and the energized parts of the power line. Next. Now, the third way is retrofitting. This is expensive, but I think there are countries that have done it. I think Mongolia did it, and they had some very good results. So retrofitting means that you make some changes in the power lines the way they are. And we are talking about, for the most part, we are talking about the distribution lines here. So the photograph on the left, what these gentlemen have done is that they have put an insulator to cover that bit of that conductor, meaning that now if this bird is sitting on that crossbar, even if its wing touches that, you see the area where with the pointed red arrow, and then the other wing touches this other conductor, then it cannot complete the circuit and it's safe to go. So these are modifications that can be done. And perhaps some of you have got more experience about this, especially those ones from Europe. And I understand that they also are very effective in reducing electrocution. Another way of retrofitting already existing power lines is to install patch pads. And these are bald eagles sitting on top of a patch pad. And you notice that the pad is above the energized conductors. Good enough, the North Americans actually separate the neutral wire and install it below these other energized conductors. Unfortunately, this is not the case in our region, but it's extremely important. You can see that the distance between the conductors in this case is wide enough. And with a patch pad like this, I think the eagles are more or less safe, because when they're leaving, they're not likely to touch any of those conductors. Next. So for new power lines, that's where we come in. And I think we should come in big. So I'll tell you a story, because it's just involved in a couple of assessments with some power lines here. So I went onto the ground with the surveyors and the engineers, and then we were looking at some critical habitats where the proposed power lines are supposed to go through. And then after my assessments, I looked at the engineers and asked them, it's like, I wish that we as ornithologists were engaged way before making a decision on where these proposed whale leaves are going to pass, because I could easily see that there are alternative routes that would avoid these critical habitats. And they agreed. They said that they never thought about it that way, and it's important that experts are involved right from the beginning. I'm not even talking about after the ESIA, no. I'm talking about even before the ESIA is done. at the planning stage, these energy conversion and transmission companies should involve experts, and these experts can help them actually decide on alternative routes that are away from critical habitats. The other thing that these avian experts can do is to identify critical habitats. And these include non-migratory flyways, wetlands, riverine or riparian gallery forests, large cultivated fields with thickets, very important for flocks of storks and other birds that feed on grain, and then solid waste dump sites near urban areas. Perhaps that applies for most of our upcoming cities in Africa. We can, discuss with them and tell them to avoid these areas because these are critical habitats that are likely to make power lines be in conflict with birds. Next. So we can also, as experts, of course, as I said, try to even influence the engineers when they're doing their costing to choose towers that are less lethal to birds. And the one on the left, the Guy cross-rope suspension tower has got minimum patching spaces and is far much better than their darling double circuit tower. I think this, I'll speak for Kenya, this is the one that they like the most because I think there's a reason why, because they also look at other things like landscape, the topography and other things. But we can, at that point, before they even do it, like when they are doing the costing, you can tell them that for critical habitats, please do not put these double circuit towers, but see if you can cost for these guide cross rope suspension towers. Next. Now, the distribution lines, the deathbeds of birds. I think for new lines, we can seriously consider underground cabling. I know it's expensive. I would wish to hear from others, maybe those ones from Europe, like how much it costs in places like the Netherlands and parts of northern Germany to do that. But from literature, it looks like the Dutch have actually managed to put all their distribution lines underground and managed to reduce the electrocution to almost zero that comes from them. For our case here in Kenya, we and myself and others, we're trying to see if the government can actually switch from these lethal concrete poles back to the wooden poles, because at least that gives us a leeway of reducing the electrocution by some small percentage. And also encourage the engineers to insulate conductors in critical habitats. If a distribution line is going through a forest reserve, then it would rather we have all the energized conductors inside some plastic or rubber sheet, other than leaving them naked like the way they do. Next. So let me now give you a little bit of some insights from what we are trying to do in Kenya. We're just starting, and I wouldn't say that we are anywhere to like achieving anything substantial, but we're just starting. And in this picture here, you can see the different players or the stakeholders in power generation or conversion and transmission in Kenya. The blue part, of course, is the energy conversion bit. You have the Kenya Electricity Generating Company, KenGen, and then this geothermal development company that's involved in harnessing steam energy into electrical energy. And then there are many private wind farms coming up, solar wind farms also, and others producing power from diesel generators. And then when it comes to the transmission, there's only one company that's involved, the Kenya Electricity Transmission Company Limited, KETRACO. And then when it comes to distribution, then we have the Kenya Power and Lighting Company. Those are the
the main stakeholders or the key players of power conversion, energy conversion and transmission in Kenya. Next. So, how much does one electrocuted bird cost in kilowatt hours? If I may ask you, what would be your answer? Now, I asked this to a friend, two friends actually. One is a colleague, he's a mammologist, and then the other one works with a transmission company. So the mammologist answered me with another question. He said, do you really want to make power more expensive than it is right now? We are already overburdened by the cost of power. And we both didn't know what to say after that. Then the other colleague who works for the transmission company, what he said is that, you see, our business is in transmitting power from one place to the other. So hold on to those answers and then look at this matrix. So here are 3 high voltage transmission lines that are in the process of being installed here in Kenya. And then you can pay attention to the cost of land acquisition and involuntary displacement, or whatever they call the resettlement action plan, and the cost of impact on avifauna. The difference is glaring. Why? I think one of the reasons why it's like this is because in a free market, it's easy for someone to leave office and go down to wherever the way live is, and they ask for the price of land and come and make a budget of a compensation plan. But then how do you cost for natural capital? It's not easy. I don't think if we have the means and capacity to do that. Now, another thing is that we have inadequate data on bird electrocution and collisions, because at the stage where these companies are negotiating with the client or the people who are going to support these projects, the clients insist on real data, tangible data. Because if you say that we are going to include this in the financial model, then they would ask like, okay, then how can you quantify that? I don't think if we have that. Speaking for my country, we don't have that data. And we are hoping that maybe with all this that we are doing, we can come up with a framework of collecting data that can actually be used now to push for the cost, the real cost of the impact that these lines have on avifauna. And there's another thing that has cropped up, it's a bit disturbing, is since you can see that the RAP costs a lot of money, like 5 million, 6 million, 6 million for lines that are less than 120 kilometers. That's a lot of money because the prices of land and infrastructure is high. What these companies do is to try to reduce those costs by suggesting wayleaves that go through protected areas and areas with less human settlement. From their point of view, I think it makes sense, because then if you really like want to win something, you want to win money from the World Bank or IFC or the African Development Bank, it's important that you make your budget realistic. It's important that you make your budget as minimal as possible because you're competing with others. But we have seen a heavy toll on protected areas, wayleaves going through protected areas, wayleaves going through critical habitats that have got less human settlement. And the outcome is that, of course, we know that downstream, we're going to have huge negative impact on wildlife. So how much does it cost in kilowatt hours for a dead African white-backed vulture under a transmission line? That's still a question to be answered. Next. So this is our proposed plan of action. We wish to start off by publicizing the dangers that power lines pose to birds through lectures like the one that I'm delivering now, posters, publications, podcasts, radio talks, and we hope to get all the way to the funding agencies, the World Bank. I think the World Bank has got some very good caveats or measures to see that this is done. And you can see that there are projects that are funded in the ESIA. There's no joke. They really have to prove that these studies have to be done. But we also have to get to others like the African Development Bank. I don't think if those ones really pay attention to this kind of impact as IFC and World Bank. Then we also need to talk to the government officers. When I started off with these engagements with power lines and birds, I was actually naive and I was surprised by how much I've learned just going out and looking at the configuration of these power lines and seeing how dangerous they are to birds. This is someone who is already working with birds, and I was not as aware as I should. Think about government officials, the cabinet secretaries and others. We need to tell them that some power lines are killing birds, and we need to demonstrate to them how they're doing so. Then we also need to get to the general public. So once we've done that, the next course of action, thinking now to do some capacity building, and we'll do it in two phases. The first one is start off with the engineers and the surveyors and the environmental officers in this power generation or conversion companies. The ones that I have met, the engineers, the surveyors, the environmental officers, actually almost all of them were not aware that power lines can be dangerous to birds. I remember talking to an engineer that really was concerned, and he really wanted to know how he can make his substation safe and high voltage transmission lines, the transformers safe to birds, because he also likes birds, you know? Now, once we've done that, we move to the next phase, the local communities, because we can identify the critical habitats. But this, as you saw, these power lines, they cover long distances. So we cannot do it on our own. We need to train local community living near critical habitats so that they can know how to, they can walk a section of the power line and collect carcasses. They can bring to us for identification, and we can use that information to find out the killer poles. By the way, I didn't mention that if you're looking at a transmission line, it's not the whole transmission line that can be dangerous to birds. There are particular sections that are really lethal to birds. And those are the ones that go through these critical habitats, and some of the particular poles and even transformers that are really lethal to birds, depending on many other things that I mentioned. And once we identify those, then these are the areas where the local scouts can actually put more of their energy and help us collect data. Then the last bit is to conduct regular surveys along critical habitat. That's the monitoring bit. And that's my area that I really would be interested to see happening. And we know that we can come up with methods because the methods are already existing for monitoring wind farms, like vantage point surveys. We can take a section of the power line and perform vantage point surveys and see how many birds are passing through, at what height, how long they are lingering around, and record any forms of collision. We can also use advanced technologies like having sensors that can take photographs or detect movement at night, and we can tell that, okay, this is the number of birds that are passing through this area, and at night, this is the height at which they are flying, and it's possible that if the weather is bad, they can come down and collide with the power lines. So we know that we can do that. We can also do road counts, and of course, for the wayleaves, we can very easily run point counts on line transects. Now, if this data can be put in a database, I think it will then be very, very important in trying to evaluate how much in terms of kilowatt hours a dead bird costs. Now, having said that, thank you very much. And it's something that many organizations are involved in. There's, of course, the National Museums of Kenya. There's the Kenya Electricity Transmission Company. There's the Kenya Power, the Kenya Wildlife Service, the Kenya Birds of Prey Trust, Nature Kenya, and the National Environmental Management Authority. But these guys, NEMA, the last logo that you see there, they're the ones who give licenses to these lines. And before they give the licenses, the ESIA has to be shared and reviews given, and the companies must act on those reviews. Now, so far, for my involvement, I've only seen this for the high voltage transmission lines, but I haven't seen any of this for the distribution lines. And that's where we know that most of the electrification is happening. So thank you very much. We are hoping that we can come up with some consortium, like African-wide consortium, even start off like championing or pushing, lobbying our government to stop on concrete poles, and then we'll move on to the next. Thank you. And yeah, that's the end of my